Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. This is our 138th show. Today, our guests are Peter Desberg and Jeffrey Davis, author of Pitch Like Hollywood. And I can tell this is a super popular book because we have people from all over the world who've signed up to listen to this interview today. And I'm so thrilled to have both of you guys on.
Thank you.
So why don't we start off with Peter, you giving us about your background, and then Jeffrey, you can talk about your background.
Okay.
Well, spent most of my life as a boring university professor, which I guess is redundant. But basically in the area of cognitive science. And I later went back and got a clinical psychology license. In addition, I used to run a Sunday morning cable show teaching people to create instructional software. And it was me against the televangelists on Sunday morning. It was very exciting. Spent a lot of time writing books, being an academic. One of the things that I did was Jeffrey and I did some research in the area of, should we call it, academic humor, and I dragged Jeffrey to a couple of academic humor conferences, and talk about an oxymoron.
Yeah. I spent 18 years in academia myself.
You know the drill.
Jeffrey, how about your background?
I have never passed a science or math course in my life. I depend on Peter to do the adding and subtracting. I am 3 generations show business. My great uncle was a film composer, had a lot of step parents that were actors and producers, and my dad was a writer producer. So I came to it, and actually the truth is I told my dad I wanted to go into show business, and he begged and pleaded and unfortunately, because I was 25, I didn't listen. And so that's what I've been doing.
How many years did you spend in the industry yourself?
I spent about 35. And I still dip my toe in occasionally. One of the
and what shows did you work on, or did you?
Oh my God. Well, certainly nothing that won a Peabody Award. Let me start there. I think my first job was doing a bunch of Love Boats, which, and you look back on that, I used to think, oh gosh, it was a great show because so many writers got hired on it, because it was it was an anthology series. And I worked on Night Court and Different Stroke, most of the stuff that Norman Lear produced but didn't actually have his hand in, except as an executive producer. So give me a break. Lots of those shows. And then later got into documentary writing, and then in the mid 2000s started producing, visited Canada a lot, which is around the time I met Peter. He pulled me out of going to Canada in the winter. So,
well, I'm glad to have you both here. So guys, why did you write this book? And it's a terrific book, obviously, from especially all the people who are signing on to listen.
You want to go? Oh, well, I'll just say that this is Peter's book. He had the idea for the book, and the minute he told me the premise of it, and of course it's morphed and grown over the time that we wrote it, I said I really have to be involved in this book, because my whole career I had problems with stage fright and pitching and persuasion. And the thing that I think is really cool about this book is that, unlike a lot of the books on the subject, there's a lot of material on persuasion and stage fright. And so I knew it was a book that I wanted to read. So then I had to help write it. And that's my story.
And Peter?
No, it was interesting that Jeffrey and I wrote a couple of books where we interviewed Hollywood comedy writers. And one of the things that kept coming up in these interviews were pitching stories. And so Jeffrey and I initially said, let's write a book on how to pitch better. And as we were, and it was really meant for Hollywood. And as we kept doing it, we kept saying, you know, these principles are omni-applicable. You can use these anywhere. But it took the Harvard Business Review writing an article saying, we have some money to do the biggest scale research study on pitching ever, and we're going to go to the most difficult arena there is, Hollywood. And I said, of course. I mean, these principles run across just about every field.
And so Peter, what's your definition of pitching?
You know, that's a great question, because in the beginning of the book, we talk about a lot of stories where pitches happened without the intention of it being a pitch, and just by circumstance, elevator pitches, etc., it ended up being, you know, great shows got started that way. But we said for our purposes, it's a scheduled meeting where you have a specific thing that you want to present to people.
And Jeffrey, how do you define pitch?
The same way. I would just add that we talk a lot in the book about the idea of pitching as selling is the wrong idea. That a pitch, and we're probably going to talk a lot about this today.
Yeah.
A pitch is a conversation. If nobody likes being sold something. Nobody likes because selling something is talking at someone. And what we learned through all the interviews we did, and I just think from our own experience, is if you engage the buyer, for want of a better word, in a conversation, you may or may not sell what you came to pitch that day, but you're selling yourself as you're presenting yourself as well as the product. And I think that's what a lot of people forget when they pitch. They just want to present and get out of that room as fast as possible because it's not comfortable.
One of the things that we decided, Jeffrey came up with a really good idea of saying, let's find people who've been really successful in pitching and get some stories about this. We balanced that with, you know, being a boring academic, having a lot of research in there as well, and found some incredible stories. And to illustrate the point Jeffrey's talking about, we interviewed a woman who is the head of an advertising agency. And she talked about when she was starting out, she went on a pitch, and the art director was pitching somebody from a tire company. And he said, we have 6 different approaches. What do you think? And the guy said, I hate every one of them. And she's thinking, that's it, I'm dead in the water. But again, this principle of a conversation, this guy was so clever. And he said, which one do you hate the least? And he got the guy talking, and he really talked about what he was looking for, which they got to hear, and eventually got the gig.
And it's good that that person was a good listener. Jeffrey, from doing this as a career, is this more art or science?
Oh, I think it's well, I've never thought about, I didn't think about that consciously until Peter brought it up, but I think it's both. You have to have, and I'll substitute the word craft for science. I think that you have to have certain skills. You have to do your homework. That's all the science of it, the preparation of it. But it's an art, because for everything you sell, you're not going, for every pitch you make, maybe one, I don't even know what the statistics are because I've never looked, but what's important is to build relationships. And that's how I look at it. So that's the art of it, is like, you have to come in knowing who that person is. That's the science, but the art is listening.
Well, but to stick up for science a little bit, there's been a tremendous amount of research in a lot of areas that, if you know, gives you a real leg up. And some of it are just little things you would never think about that make a huge difference. For example, we think it's funny that people don't usually pay attention to issues like, what time of day do you want to pitch if you have a choice? And the research is really clear. The earlier, the better, because there's a phenomenon called decision fatigue. And if you have a really important decision to make and you're feeling a little bit you don't want to make that big decision. But in the morning, people make those decisions more.
Yeah, I think the same as you do. Love this in the book. There's a story in the beginning about your friend presenting a movie idea to a studio, and he ends up pitching to a dog. And I actually watched that movie that they're referring to, and I want you to tell the story. Please explain what happened and why this is relevant to your book.
The head of New Line Cinema has a German Shepherd that he absolutely loves. He's got doctor's notes up and down, so he can take the dog pretty much anywhere. And so our friend was a producer, came in with his writer, and they started pitching. And they were well into the pitch. And all of a sudden he says, "Excuse me, I have to make a quick phone call." And as he's about to walk out the door, he says, "Keep pitching," which means basically it's the dog that's lying on the couch. And so they look at each other and they start laughing, saying, "Are we being punked? Do you think they're videotaping this?"
Yeah.
And then they decided, you know what, let's pitch the dog. And they did. And then he came back toward the end and he bought the project. And I think one of the things that really was interesting in that story to me was the difference between just pitching versus really making contact with people, because they definitely saw, hey, this dog is important to this guy. We don't want to denigrate that. And so what they saw was the humanity of these people being willing to do that and treating his dog seriously. That probably helped sell it. Although he'd like to say he thought the dog liked the pitch.
I would have said the same thing about my English bulldog, Roxy. If she didn't like it, I probably am not going for it.
Exactly.
So
that's my favorite
Jeffrey.
story in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that story. I wondered, like, when they pitched Seinfeld, how did they pitch that when it's a show about nothing? Like, what did that, Jeffrey? What did that pitch must have looked like?
Well, first of all, the truth about that situation is that they both were very famous at that point, Seinfeld and Larry David, and nobody wanted to do the show though. Because they didn't know what it was. I do know the circumstances of that, and they're unusual. But again, you have two people who are famous and have reputations, especially Seinfeld at that point. And what they basically did is they said, "We'll give you 4 episodes," and then it caught on. I mean, that's very uncommon even today, is to say for a network, for one of the major 4 to say, "We'll only give you 4 shows." And the network thought in its usual wisdom that it was going to die. It's not really, but I think the trick of that show is it's not a sitcom. And that's what the network thought it was. And it's not a show about nothing. If you really look at the show, the best of those seasons, the show kind of fizzled after Larry David left the show. It's really an illustrated, you remember that it always started and ended with Jerry Seinfeld doing a stand-up.
Yeah.
And they went to the show and they were, whatever he was talking about that week, they illustrated it in the show. So it wasn't your standard 4-camera sitcom. And I think it was just luck and timing. People were ready for something different. But I think that was an inside joke, that there was a show about nothing. because it really wasn't. They dealt with all kinds of issues in a comedic way. You know, even the Kennedy assassination was probably, that's probably, but the if you remember that episode,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
classic episode. So I never bought I always thought that was sort of a PR thing, that it was a show about nothing. Oh,
Was there a show that became a hit that was, they kept pitching it over and over and nobody got it, and it finally somebody did get it and it took off? And why did it take so long, based on your experience of knowing the industry?
If it would be okay with you, I'd switch that to features,
Go ahead.
because TV works so differently. I made a list for you of movies that nobody wanted to make, and we just start with Forrest Gump, which took 9 or 10 years to get made. Nobody thought it would make a movie, and then when, I think the same with Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., you just go on and on and on, and what I really think is one of Peter's and my favorite human beings, and said the great thing, William Goldman, the great William Goldman, writer of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, said nobody knows anything. And I think that's the real truth of Hollywood and any other business. You don't know what's going to work,
I
and
agree with you totally.
you just stay with it. The real hero of the Forrest Gump thing, and there was a novel, by the way, so they weren't basing it, it wasn't an original, it was based on a novel, was a woman named Wendy Feinerman, who just stayed with that project for 9 years and believed in it so much she was able to get other people to believe in it. And I think that's what you need in any industry. I think that's applicable to any form of business.
You just have to have stick-to-itiveness and just
Right. I think that's what Jerry, to come back to Seinfeld, they just really believed in the show, and they wanted to do it because they wanted to have some fun together. They were old friends.
But
And
it's any area. I mean,
yeah,
you look at a book like Chicken Soup for the Soul,
Yep.
and that poor fellow just no shoe leather left. He was knocking on every door and said, okay, I'll do it myself, and ended up making an industry out of it.
It's funny you should say about the need to do that. I wrote a book. My second book was called Small Business Turnaround. My publisher didn't want it, and I wrote to 48 publishers, and everybody was turning me down. I said, I'll even underwrite the book. I mean, I believed in it that much. Finally, one publisher came back, my original publisher said, I know somebody who might be interested. And that guy didn't even look at it. He just sent me a contract, and that book was named one of the 30 best business books in 2000. And yet nobody believed. They all thought, who wants a book on how to turn around the small business, when all the other books on turnarounds were about like Chrysler, big corporations.
If you'll follow stories about how things get bought, I had a book that it was a joke book. I thought it was very funny. I sent it around to 33 publishers, got turned down by just about everybody. Simon and Schuster ended up publishing it.
Oh, wow.
So when I met my editor, I said, how did you come to buy this book? And he said, this book is the result of a brownout in New York. I was in my office one day, it was summer, electricity was out, we don't have any windows in the Simon and Schuster building. It was really hot, my office door was open. It's never open. And I heard somebody laughing, so I walked out to see what it was. He said, one of my readers had your proposal and was laughing. I said, well, even if it had been a regular air-conditioned day, if your reader likes it, oh, I never listen to my readers.
Wow. Wow. So what does a Hollywood pitch look like, which you write about in the book, and how is it different from pitching other types of industries?
Peter?
I think that let me give you a sort of bigger answer first, because we talk a lot about the use of story. And in cognitive science, there's a tremendous amount of research about how people remember stories way longer than facts. There's a plethora of research. We know this. And the two things that Hollywood pitches really thrive on They work really hard on getting curiosity in the listener, building that up, and using a lot of emotion. Two things that in business usually, and that was not me, whatever that sound was. I'm gonna be on record.
Mhm.
And so infusing those things into a pitch. The other thing is in a pitch, you want the person to reach forward and say, what happens next? Rather than saying, here's my PowerPoint, let me show you the 4 stages of development. And in a good Hollywood pitch, it's like you always avoid getting to the ending because you want them to ask, so you can hand them your screenplay and say, here's your chance to
Shut
find
up, Mark.
Anyway, so again, you want to get people curious about what it is, and you want to try and
Jeffrey!
and you want to get as much involvement as you can all the way through it.
Jeffrey, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's excellent. I would just say that we should always remember that that any great pitch tells a story. And the minute you forget that you're in the business of storytelling, I don't care what your product is, you're going to lose your audience.
Oh my Lord.
I'm getting some kind of interference on my end. I hope nobody else can hear that. I have no what it.
Yeah, we don't know why that's coming
Oh
up
my
either.
Lord, Peter!
Now they're asking for Peter.
That's very strange. I have no idea. I use duct tape on everybody in the house to make sure.
Sarah, oh my Lord.
So,
Well, see, we're building up curiosity now.
so yeah, so I just think it's really important to tell stories. And I think that was the
Vivian.
thing that we came to in as we worked on the book and as the book morphed. And I think we realized that we had to get really great stories to illustrate the point.
And I can tell you the little story we have in the book. I had somebody come in to see me who worked as an investment banker. He was a young guy out of Stanford on the fast track. And he said, every week I have to appear before the board with the stats from a new company, present it so they could see if they want to invest in it. He says, all I'm doing is spewing numbers and I'm looking at glazed over eyes. And I get so scared doing this because I know there's just nothing going on. And so we said, well, let's try an experiment. Let's use 3-act structure and change the way you present it. And so all of a sudden, in the first act, he created some curiosity in terms of what is this company doing? What are their goals? How are they doing it? In the second act, we built up the conflict and said, here are the risks. Here are some issues we need to really look into. And in the third act, we resolved it. And the first thing he said to me was, I'm finding that I'm using like half the numbers I used to use, because if it doesn't move the story along, that number isn't necessary. And he says, I'm getting a great response from the people I'm talking to now. And the other people at my level have now adopted the same procedure when they're giving their presentations.
I'm curious to know, and Jeffrey, maybe you know the answer to this, is how many TV and movie scripts does a major network see each year? It's got to be like venture capitalists, I'm guessing in the thousands. And what's the success rate of getting a pilot or a movie greenlit? And what's the chances you'll even have financial success? So what do those numbers look like?
So with your permission, I'll break this into a couple of parts. So I've actually done the research on this, and also some of it is just being around people in the industry every day, working as I do at Loyola with people who are not real teachers, but writers. You know, we come to teaching as a second career. So you asked about pilots. So let's
Yep.
just talk for a minute about the networks. So because even as everybody is saying, and I think this is really important for everybody to hear in case they're contemplating a career in television, there are so many more opportunities in television if you count streaming, if you count cable, if you count all, and we can't even count the number of streaming platforms. But the most money is still, to this day, in the 4 major networks. So what happens at a network, I'll just break this down really quick. What happens in a network is that in the spring, people usually pitch, maybe in the close to 70,000 stories. And these are not beginners. These are people who are writer, producers, showrunners. And then by the end of the summer, the networks, the 4 networks, typically ask to see, they'll take about 500 out of that 100 or whatever 1,000, and then out of that in the fall they'll ask for scripts to be written. And each network, the numbers are really interesting here, and I'm not a numbers guy, but this really is fascinating to me. Out of that, 70 pilots are written and shot for each of those 4 networks. If you think about it, I'm sorry, 70 get to the writing stage, so where the person is, or team, they're paid for the scripts, but only 20 in each network get shot. And I couldn't tell you how many get made, but it's small. So you can see how small that is.
I mean,
But
that's 60 out of 100,000.
right. But that's only the majors. There are, Netflix and Amazon and Hulu, which is really blowing up right now because they were smart enough to make deals with all the major networks, and they don't necessarily even have to write pilots. If you're Dan and Amy Palladino, who created Gilmore Girls and in Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, they're not going to ask you for a pilot, no matter what network you're on. But certainly because they chose to do it on Amazon, I believe probably because of the freedom, you get a lot more freedom on the streamers. So, but that's the basic number. Now, would you like to hear the film stats? Because that's okay. And Peter will tell you he's the stat guy, not me, but I just find this fascinating. So let's just take tentpole movies. The people here I don't know. I mean, I don't go to see tentpole movies. My children are grown now. So everybody, you all know what a tentpole movie is.
You're talking about like the Marvel movies.
Marvel movies, yeah, exactly. Or the Bond franchise is
Right.
Yeah, those kinds of things. So the budget now is between $200 and $300 million. And let's not even talk about Avatar, because that's so, I don't know how that this sequel is going to make its money back. It'll be interesting. So global box office has to be at about $1 billion. So each studio makes about 70 movies a year, 60 movies a year. So you get the odds. My advice to anybody is what I tell my students, both the grads and the undergrads: go into television, because you're going to work. Movies, smaller, it used to be that, and I'll finish up by saying that it used to be that nobody wanted to work in television, that it was considered, if you wanted to go and work in movies, TV was considered the graveyard.
Inferior. Yeah.
Yes. And now everybody, I think it's partly the advent of the showrunner, but everybody wants to work in TV. And some of the best movies are being done, financed. The movie that won the Academy Award last year was financed by Apple. So it was Coda. So,
Yeah.
So, I think the game has changed considerably, but you're always going to have those tentpole movies. And it just seems like such a shame that they spend $300 million on these movies that only, Peter, will you talk a little bit about the 4-box? What that's the other element in getting a movie made.
Yeah, when people are looking at the feasibility of a movie, the industry has basically said, you've got basically demographic areas that you have to look at. That you've got kids, you've got teens, you've got adults, you've got older adults. And basically, the more boxes you hit, the bigger the box office is going to be, and the more likely you're going to make your money back. So if you have like a really scary horror film that has a little comedy in it that kids are going to like, but adults are also going to like, and it's going to bring in a ton of people, you have a better chance than if you have like a serious drama.
Right.
So they're constantly looking at that because, again, it's an investment,
Right.
and
It's
they're
business.
just looking at their market.
So, Peter, you guys write in the book that when you're making a pitch, the decision's usually made in the first 5 to 10 minutes. Why is that?
Oh boy, the effects of first impressions, it's difficult to overstate. And in the first 5 minutes, if it's a good pitch, you're going to be giving them the big picture of what you're doing. And that's what they're all listening for. And so the kind of impression you make, and again, what I'm saying is they're looking at the feasibility that not only do we like your idea, but we think you can pull it off, is made very, very quickly. And everything else is sort of questioning, are you the kind of person that can actually bring this off?
Now, you mentioned it's important to come off as creative. Why is that important? What are the benefits in terms of convincing your audience that they should invest in you, buy from you, or support you in whatever it is that you're pitching?
It's interesting that people used to base IQ on these tests that sort of tested math and logic. And the more current view of looking at that also has a section on creativity and a section on problem solving. And so people are saying, okay, even if your idea is good, stuff is going to happen. Are you the kind of person that can pull it off, can deal with difficult situations, can deal with problems, can deal with changing markets, can deal with different changes? So again, they're looking at that because that's an index of how successful you're going to be under all the stuff that's going to be thrown at you.
Jeffrey, you have anything to add?
I have an example of that. My sister-in-law, who actually is interviewed in the book, I think I can now reveal that she's my sister-in-law.
Okay.
She is a treasurer at Riot Games. And by the way, if we think about movies and television being this big part of the entertainment industry, they are small compared to the amounts of money that gaming makes in the and it is part of the entertainment industry. Anyway, she told us that they want to work now. They are dying to work with creatives because the technical people who make the games, they are absolutely they're necessary, but they can't write the games because their minds are, their brains are wired differently. Having never been a gamer, and I don't want to insult anyone here who is, I don't really understand the way a gamer's mind works, but I do know now a number of very successful creatives who are working in gaming. It's another area to go into in the entertainment business, as is podcasting. These things are all exploding. So you want creatives. I think that kind of addresses the question. I think that You get these big writers who are making deals at gaming companies, which we didn't see 15 years ago.
You know, it's a
Well,
little-
and
it's a-
they're just like a movie. I mean, these
Yes,
games are
yes.
just like movies, and they need creative writers to come up with. In fact, I was at an NFT conference, basically a gamer conference,
Mhm.
and I asked them, "What's your biggest need?" And it wasn't back-end developers like it used to be. It's people to be able to come up with the creative ideas for the games and the graphical look and feel. That was the two most important things that they needed the most.
The
But
two
there's-
guys that, oh, I'm sorry, Peter, go ahead.
There's interesting research now that kids are learning scientific method better through gaming than through their science lab classes.
Oh, no surprise.
Didn't help me. Why couldn't that have been around when I needed it?
I'm with you, Jeffrey.
I think it's interesting just to note that the two brothers who produced this movie that was a big success last year. I'm sorry, I'm going to blow up the title. I'm going to mess up the title. Everything All at Once, All the Time, or this movie that came out and was just amazing and didn't cost a lot of money, by the way. Had Michelle Yeoh in it and Jamie Lee Curtis, and those were the big names. But those two brothers just made a deal at Riot Games for millions upon millions of dollars. So that's a specific. I just saw that in the Variety the other day. So, you know, they want to work. It's the same thing. If you've been successful in one area, it's like if you write. I mean, Peter's a novelist. I know he's too shy to tell you that, but he's a novelist. The great thing for him is if he wants that, we're in a world now where if you have been successful in one area, they're going to look at that and they're going to say, oh, this worked in that area, so that means it's going to work for us. In fact, there's no scientific proof of that, but it's great that they think that, because nobody wants to take risks. It's because it's still a money game.
Well, and that's like Elon Musk. Everybody assumes whatever he touches is going to turn to gold, and we'll see if that happens in Twitter, right?
Oh, God.
Well,
Yeah.
we're already seeing that.
So
And-
you guys write about the hook is really important. We know that when you go in, and we watch on Shark Tank that what do they always ask him? Tell us your story. So how do you go, Jeffrey, how do you go about developing the hook?
Okay. Well, the hook is this one line that makes you want to hear more. So basically, and Peter, you can jump in here because Peter and I have done all of this work together, developing this. And by the way, this is just our opinion of what a hook is. I could find many other definitions of it. It's that single sentence that distills the story down and makes you want to hear more. And
Peter, you as a novelist, what do you say?
yeah,
It's just the important thing is you get the big picture view there right away.
Right.
And, you know, you're not giving them drips and drabs and making them come together with it. It's when a pitch is starting, you want to know, what is this thing going to be about? And, you know, there's an interesting thing. Years ago, I had the opportunity to interview John Scully. Remember John Scully?
Yeah, sure.
And I asked him at one point, what makes you such a great presenter? And he said, I don't think of myself as a great presenter, but I do have an MBA in marketing. And what they taught me was find out what your audience wants to know and tell them. And I can tell you, you know, for years and years, because I deal with people that have stage fright, they come in and they show me their presentations and they say, here's what I want to say. And then right away, we have to beat them down with a stick saying, no. What is it that your audience is going to want to know?
Peter, what do you tell people to get them over stage fright? Because there have been very many famous people, even Bill Russell used to throw up before every single basketball game because he said of stage fright going out to the court. So as a psychologist, what's the tools and everything that you give them to help them overcome that? And Jeffrey, I'd like to know what famous actors are you aware of that
Any.
suffered through this?
Go ahead, Peter, you first, because he's the expert. I'm.
Well, I start with, you should buy my book on stage fright.
Yeah.
But
Have a
but
conversation with it.
it's important to understand that there aren't haves and have-nots. It's situational, and under the right circumstances, everyone will get it. And it's just a question of how you're viewing and interpreting the situation, how you're viewing the consequences, both in terms of business and personal, that you can use to scare yourself with it. I'm trying to distill a lifetime's worth of work into a
Just a few key things.
But one of the very first things we do is we get people to stop looking at things that happen to them as facts and look at them as interpretations. So let's say, for instance, I'm pitching you and I'm looking at you and I see you doing this, looking at your wristwatch. And most people will tell you, uh-oh, he's bored. That's it, I'm done. And so right away we would start saying, is there any other reason why he might look at his, at his watch? Well, it could be that he's got a really important meeting coming up and he's enjoying this one so much he wants to see how much longer he can savor the moment. If I see you yawn, what does that mean? Uh-oh, he's bored out of his skull, or he didn't sleep well last night. So getting people to reevaluate. And there are two factors that determine how much stage fright you'll get. One is your prediction of how well you're going to do. And the other is how important are the consequences of doing well. And that second one is the one that people really exaggerate. And it's so easy to get people to say, well, if I go in and I mess this up, then within 10 minutes, they're all calling their friends saying, don't take a meeting with this guy, he's terrible, and my life is over. So it's very easy to run away with those things.
I'll give you 3 examples of 3 famous people, and there's dozens and millions, but Laurence Olivier, famously stage fright. Barbra Streisand didn't perform for almost 25 years because she was so frightened of going on stage. And I just read recently that Carly Simon is not ever going to perform again because she can't deal with it. Rod Stewart used to have, I think it was Rod Stewart. I hope it was Rod Stewart, because otherwise this is not going to be a good story. If Rod Stewart used to have the band kick him to get him on stage.
Carly Simon was famous for being kicked in the butt by her
Yeah,
band.
see, and that was pre-Me Too. So that can't happen now.
But with
thankfully.
Rod, there's a great Rod Stewart story that when he was starting out, he was playing a concert here with a fairly well-known but esoteric blues harmonica player. And he said, I can't believe I'm going to have to go on stage with this guy. And he did the entire show standing behind an amp so people couldn't see him.
Wow.
There are myriad stories with Laurence Olivier. He called up his friends who were great actors and said, how do you deal with it? And he got 2 answers back: drugs and alcohol.
So we have a question from the audience. Do you believe that what is effective in a pitch may change over time?
Of course. It changes with whomever you're pitching to. That's why that's the art of it. Just to go back for a minute to art versus science or art versus craft. You have to be able to read the room. So you can't, there's no one size fits. And that was, I think, by the way, why that's another reason why I think we wanted to write this book, because a lot of books on pitching are kind of one size fits all. And I'd like to dissuade anybody of that notion that, it's everybody's going to handle it differently. And I think especially the things that Peter's come up with, because this is his area of expertise. The preparation, persuasion, and stage fright is going to change as the situation changes, and you have to be ready for it. And the main way to be ready for it is do your homework on the person you're pitching to.
Well, in a couple of your questions, you gave us some great questions to look at. And one of them has to do with what are some of the worst things you can do in a pitch? And probably
Yes.
right up there with number one is be defensive. And the thing we look at is how do you handle questions and objections when you're giving a pitch?
Yeah.
And there's probably nothing more important than being able to do this. And I'll tell you one of the things I learned from an old boss of mine who was a psycholinguist from Texas. And it used to be funny hearing this thick Texas accent coming back at me with academic arguments. But he taught me a wonderful thing inadvertently. In science, what you want to do when you're arguing is coming up with the killer question, the question that the other guy can't answer, so you're right. So he and I would argue constantly. I'd come up with the killer question, but what he would do is paraphrase my question. And in paraphrasing it, he weakened my question. And then his answer would be to his paraphrase of what I had said rather than what I said. So before we let anybody go and do a pitch, the first thing we say is, you need to know every possible objection that people are going to have, and don't let them have it. You treat each one of those in your pitch, because you're going to give a much nicer version of what that is than any, when somebody's sitting there waiting till the question time comes and say, well, how are you going to handle this? And what are you going to do when they do? That's the worst way to have to answer a question, when somebody's practically pointing their index finger at you saying, here's what you missed and here's why you're wrong. But if you've already covered it, but you've covered it in a really nice way, then if they ask you that, oh, well, we've already talked about that. But meanwhile, you then have control over the nicest way to present it. And you need to know what the possible objections are.
When I work with entrepreneurs, helping them pitch to investors, I say, you're like a lawyer in front of a jury. And you've got to be able to think about all the potential questions that could be asked of it and not be defensive. And even on the show today, we have one of America's most famous defense attorneys, Ted Simon, who listens to the show. And Ted is on here as well, and he's got cool stuff. We have a question from the audience. Aside from reading the room, what's the biggest blind spot that most people have when giving their pitch?
Well, I've got one. There's so many. This is one that that's kind of personal to me because I've made the mistake so many times in my career. Most people go into a room and they pitch to the big, the boss. And they forget that there's all these other people in the room. And there's that lowly person who's just starting maybe in the industry, and they're taking the notes. But that person, chances are, is going to be rising in the so-called ranks, and they're going to be in a position to say, they might say very bad things about you after the pitch if you ignored them. And you don't know where they'll be 2 years from that day. So what I've learned by doing it wrong, which I think is how the best way to learn something, is to do it badly. And then but I think talk to everybody, include everybody. And that's what we do in a conversation anyway. I always think of it as, and it's ironic because I don't drink, but I always think of it like a cocktail party. Like you're actually trying to include everybody. You're, like Peter says, you're telling a story and you want everybody to hear it.
And you want to make what Jeffrey's saying is right on, and you want to make eye contact. And if there are 6 people in the room and there's one guy that's the big cheese, of course you want to give him a little more time, but everybody gets your eye contact. And, sometimes it ends up that you see somebody in the corner taking notes. Oh, it's just the note taker. I don't have to look at him. Well, a week later, when they're discussing your pitch, he's the one that's presenting all the information and he hates you now. Not a good idea.
Mhm.
And besides
it's
that,
just-
Jeffrey, how often does the boss actually depend on the people in that room all giving him input? I mean, that note taker could say horrible things about
Yes.
it, and that could be the deal killer, right?
Oh,
I have,
absolutely.
I have to say that, oh, I'm sorry, Peter, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just saying that it's happened to me where when I was younger, and it was probably nerves, which is the reason that managing stage fright is so important. Is I don't think it was an intentional. I wasn't snubbing the person intentionally, but you were so nervous to make that buyer, was what we say in show business, love you, that you forget there's other people there who the boss is going to depend on. They don't make decisions in vacuums unless they're, there are a few people who do that, but for the most part, it's a collaborative medium. And if you're not a good collaborator, you're probably not going to last long. So I think that it's really important. And Peter's right. Of course, you want to focus on the person who has the power, but it's a conversation again. So
And
if you
it's-
think of pitching as a conversation, I think it takes a lot of the pressure off you.
But it's interesting, it's actually research. If you're pitching to one person, obviously you want to make eye contact, but the research says 50% of the time is optimal. If you don't make any eye contact, then you look like you're really uncomfortable in your skin. Nobody wants to work with you. But if
Mhm.
you're staring the whole time at somebody, you look like you're doing a science experiment with them. And you don't want the guy that tears the wings off flies either. So a nice thing to do as a rule of thumb is when they're talking, you look at them. When you're talking, it's okay to look away. Like, let me think about that for a second. Yeah, I see. And then bring your gaze back to them. But you definitely want to be looking at that.
We have another question from the audience, and this gentleman asking the question has actually bought every single person's book who's been on my show. And he asked, many times when you tell a story to pitch your product, you end up telling your story of why you created the product. How do you handle and prioritize your product story and your story when you get ready to pitch? So what's the answer to that, Peter?
Again, a lot of this is in the preparation. And again, we go back to the John Scully wisdom, which is, what does your audience want to know? And while they are investing in you, they're investing in your idea. And so you want to make sure, it's very easy to talk about ourselves.
Mm.
But you want to make sure that you really do a good job presenting the idea, particularly hitting those ideas that might make them balk.
Mm.
Giving them confidence that you've already thought about that, you already have a plan, and that this is going to be a safe venture. At the same time, you want to get the excitement of the new idea in there.
Jeffrey?
That was perfect. If anything to add to that was succinctly and well said.
Just a couple of words about preparation. There's a tremendous amount of research done on the psychology of persuasion, which I find really fascinating. And let me recommend a wonderful book. For those who haven't read it yet, run out and buy Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman.
Maybe you can type that in as well.
Jeffrey, I'll let you type while I'm talking because I'm a terrible multitasker.
Sure.
But among other things, one of the things he talks about, one of his main theses, is that we have two ways of thinking. One is very, very rapid. He calls it type 1 thinking, which is basically running on intuition. And two, deep thought. And when type 1 doesn't work, you go to type 2. And one of the things he spent his life doing is looking at how people believe that they are constantly doing type 2 thinking, this deep thinking, when in fact they're not at all. They're using their intuition. But what's interesting from a persuasive point of view is type 1, when you're pitching, is golden. Because intuition sounds like it's a very flighty thing, but it contains everything you know, everything you feel, everything you care about, every bias you have. And if I can keep you in type 1 thinking as I'm pitching to you, that means everything is okay and everything I'm saying is within the bounds of what you know and believe. The minute I put you into a place where you have to go, wait a minute now, let me figure this out, you're already starting to become skeptical. And you're looking at me in a very different way, saying, oh, not so fast, wait, which is the place you don't want him. And this is one of the reasons why Jeffrey and I talk a lot about the preparation stage of pitching, that you have to really do some research on the people you're pitching. What projects have they done before? Where are the areas where they've shined, where they like? And stay away from ideas where, you know, in Hollywood, it's kind of funny. We give an example where a friend of mine is a producer who produced a movie called The Burbs. And what happened was the studio at the end came to him and said, you're killing Tom Hanks. We don't kill Tom Hanks. We don't do that. So the ending has to be changed. He was so angry, he literally wouldn't go to see the movie premiere. And if you went to him and pitched him and said, oh, I noticed you did The Burbs, I loved it. You've just said, I have no taste. You're not going to want to deal with me. So you can't just look at their projects, but you need to know their investment in it and how they feel about it. It's a
Jeffrey,
huge part
do you
of
have anything to add, Jeffrey?
You know, again, it comes back to doing your homework. I know I'm repeating myself, but I think that's what Peter is really talking about. You know, we used to joke about Westerns because Westerns don't get made that much anymore. But if you bring someone a story about if you bring someone a Western and you know they hate Westerns, you know.
Yeah, you're pitching to the wrong person. I mean,
That's
we go
right.
through
And
that
I don't think
in the
that gets
venture world.
right. I don't think that gets
but
talked
if you
about.
know that they love movies about kids and particularly helping kids who are in trouble, and you can make your Western about a Western guy that helps kids, you got a much better shot.
Right, right.
I wondered this, and you guys had written about this in the book. You wrote about how you tried to use humor and it flopped. How and when should you use humor when making a presentation, and what types of humor should you stay away from?
Jokes.
Being the prime flopper here, the very first rule is don't tell any humor that's in bad taste. There's an old joke that's not particularly funny that I like to use, which is a kid is at one end of the house and he yells out to his mom way at the other end of the house, hey mom, is this shirt dirty? She says yes. The point of the joke being, she's saying if he's asking, it's dirty. So if there's even the slightest doubt that you shouldn't be doing something, do not use it, not worth it. And what you want to also be thinking about is telling jokes for the sake of jokes, not good. You should be using your humor to make a point. If you do that, you'll kill with it. But it has to be done really tastefully to make a point. And there's certainly enough out there that you can use to make it. Let me give you an example. When I'm talking to people I work with in therapy, there's a joke I love to tell. It says, this was from, just to give credit, Emo Phillips, a wonderful comic. This is his joke. He says, I'm walking down the street and I see a wallet. I bend down to pick it up, open it up, there's $150 cash. I want to do the right thing. So I think to myself, if this was my wallet and somebody else picked it up, what would I like to happen? I think I'd like to be taught a lesson.
That's a good way. That's a good way for us to end the show. Do you guys have any parting advice about making presentations?
I did love your question about dress for meetings, dressing
Go ahead.
appropriately. And I would just say that we heard one story, and the story is longer than that. You have to read the book to get the whole story, but someone, I would say, dress appropriately for that person. I mean, you don't necessarily have to wear a suit just because the person you're pitching to is wearing a suit. But the one thing you don't want to do is what this one person did, who was pitching to Boeing. I think it was, no, it wasn't Boeing. Where was it, Peter? It was Lexus, I think, that he came in and he claimed
Toyota. If we want
Toyota. He claimed that he was going to revolutionize their engines, and they had already been working on this and spending $1 million. But the point of the reason I'm bringing this up is that this kid came in Bermuda shorts and flip-flops. And that's the one, I would leave you with that advice. Don't ever go to a meeting in Bermuda shorts and flip-flops. Because it's what you're basically saying to other people is, I don't really care about what you think.
Yeah, it's disrespectful.
There's a very funny comedian named Dimitri Martin who has a wonderful line where he says, I just got a new apartment in Manhattan, right around the corner from Carnegie Hall. And when people say, hey, how do I find your new place? He says, oh, practice, 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 then turn left. There's no substitute for practice. And we'll leave you with a term that's golden, which is state-dependent learning. When you practice, you have to practice under as close to performance conditions as possible. So if you are going to be using notes, practice with your notes. If you're going to be using a mic, practice with a mic. If you're going to wear something that you normally don't wear, wear it. And one of the things that we advise people to do when they pitch is get a bunch of friends together who are experienced and practice pitching to each other, and ask them literally to act like a hostile audience and give you practice on your feet of being able to handle problems.
Well, I thank you both for taking the time to speak with us. The book was awesome.
Thank
And
you
I
so
think
much.
everybody got a lot out of it today.
Thank you, Mark.
Hopefully we'll have you guys back again on another book that you might collaborate on.
Well, that
thank
would be
you.
great. We
Thank you
appreciate it. This
very
was a
much.
lot of fun. Thank you.
This was a
right.
wonderful experience.
Everybody have a wonderful, safe weekend.
You too.